Our scripture today is found in the book of Mark chapter 2, verses 23 through 28. We're coming to a section in Mark where he's going to be talking about the Sabbath for the end of this chapter, the beginning of next chapter, and some of the things that Jesus does on the Sabbath, and how the holy people, the religious people, kind of react to that. And so let's read our passage and then we'll get into it. Right? Now it happened that he went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and as they went, his disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to him, "Look, why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" But he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry, he and those with him? How he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the showbread, which is not lawful to eat except for the priests, and also gave some to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath." All right? And so, we have to understand what the Sabbath is, to understand this. And so if you look in your bulletins, I put this here. Exodus chapter 20, verse 8 through 11. All right, this is after they have come out of Egypt. Moses is giving them the law for the first time. And he says to them, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it." So he says you need to keep it holy. Okay? Well, what does that mean? You know, I look over and Phyllis is shaking her head like, well, that doesn't mean a whole lot to us, right? Keep it holy. Keep it separated. Remember that it's important, right? And it's interesting, in our modern day, in the church, we tend to go, well, Sunday's the Sabbath day. Turns out Sunday's not the Sabbath day, right? Sunday was the first day of the week. The Sabbath day was the last day of the week. Saturday is the Sabbath, all right? And then you go, well, then why do we meet on Sunday? Well, because Jesus rose on Sunday. And so the early church got together to remember the resurrection on the first day of the week. So you could think every time we come to the worship service, we're coming to an Easter service, right? We're remembering the resurrection. That's why we do it on Sunday. Not because Sunday is the Sabbath. That's Saturday, right? You go, well, wait a minute. So then what are we supposed to do on Sunday? Come to church, right? Come to church, relax, right? What are we supposed to do on the Sabbath then? Rest. Whatever you need to do to rest, right? I was talking with an individual at the school who apparently you cannot go into Dollarville on Sunday. Like if I need to get stuff from my desk, I'm not supposed to go in, right? And he was telling me that he sneaks into the gym to lift weights on Sunday. And he goes, it's the Sabbath, so I guess we can't do anything. He said, well, does lifting weights relax you? He goes, yeah. Does it calm you down? Yeah. Well, that's resting for him, right? Because it says in that passage there, don't do work, right? It's not don't do any labor. It's rest. Find what relaxes you. Find what's rest. Why? Well, if we look at that, it was verse 11. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day, right? Because God rested, right? That's what it's about. That's what the Sabbath is about. That's really what we're supposed to be doing on the Sabbath, is resting. Finding some way to take a break. Because it turns out we're busy people. My mother had knee surgery a week ago, a week and a half ago. And I called her on Tuesday. Is the first time I called her. It's been like about a week. Because Dad had been texting us. He'd been sharing all of the information. Here's how your mom's doing, keeping us up to date. And so there was no need for me to call her. Well, I called her Tuesday at 9 o'clock. I think it was Tuesday. Tuesday? Or was it Wednesday? Tuesday or Wednesday. I called her at 9 o'clock at night. And I asked her how she was doing. She was real happy that I called her. But, you know, as mothers are, she had to point out that my older brother called her every day, right? And so I called her the next day at 8:30 at night and noted that, I'm calling you so late because this is when I'm done doing everything. It was Wednesday and Thursday, right? This is when I'm done with all the work I have to do in my day. And she said, yeah, you're busy people. And then I talked with my sister the next day and she said, yeah, Mom was kind of annoyed that you called so late. Like, well, if I'm going to call, it has to be when I have time to call, right? Because we're busy people. And I know I'm not the only busy person here. We're all busy. And it's real easy to find each and every one of our days scheduled and busy and something we got to do. But the reality is that the concept here of keeping the Sabbath is that we need to find a time in that busyness to take a break, to rest, right? And so God said, keep the Sabbath holy. Rest on the Sabbath. Don't work. Don't put the books away. Just rest, relax, be calm, okay? That's all he said. That's really all we get on the laws of the Sabbath from God. Anything else is not from God. Anything else is us as human beings trying to understand what God meant by that. Anything else is us trying to say, okay, well, this is work, and that is work, and this is work, right? And because people wanted to do what was right, they wanted to obey God, they really started to try to figure out what it was to work. What it was, and so the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Jewish leaders came up with all these extra laws to try to interpret it. To try to make sure that we weren't breaking the rules, right? And so they had these policies like, well, you could only go so far from your house in a day. You could only walk so far. Anything beyond that was work. But, sometimes you like to go visit people, and that's relaxing. For some of you guys, I like to stay home. That's relaxing for me. But so you like to go out and visit people. Well, they could only go so far from their house. And so they said, well, if I have a chair, that's part of my house. And so they would walk so far and they'd set their chair down and they'd walk a little further and they'd find ways around their own laws, right? But they had laws upon laws upon laws. And so what Jesus is addressing here, it is not so much the law that God gave, but the law that man made, right? And so here are the disciples, and they're not really trying to harvest the wheat. They're not trying to get all the grain they can so that they can go out and sell it. They're just plucking a few and eating it, as they're walking through. I picture more in my head an apple orchard. You're walking through and you grab an apple and you start eating the apple. It's kind of that sort of a thing. But mostly because I don't like to eat grain, just plain grain. That's kind of weird to me, but Sarah's like, that's what's for breakfast. What are you talking about? Right? And so they're grazing. They're not working. They're not really doing a lot of labor, but they're breaking that law that has been set up. The tradition, the ceremony, the ritual, right? And so they're getting a little flabbergasted going, wait a minute, we're not supposed to do that. Why are your disciples doing it? Right? And realize that they're already trying to catch Jesus here. They're already starting to have problems. They already have an understanding that he is supposed to be the Messiah. And they're saying, wait a minute, if you're supposed to be it, why aren't your followers following our rules? Right? You're stepping out of line. And so his response to them is, well, haven't you read about what David did? Right? This is his answer to them. This is his reply. Don't you know what David did? Right? And so to understand that, we need to go to 1 Samuel. Because most of us don't know what David did. Right? We don't remember. It wasn't a story that really stuck out to me, at least. It's like, oh yeah, he did that. Okay. And then you pass on, right? So David is, and let me give you the context of 1 Samuel. David is on the run from Saul, right? Saul is now trying to kill David. David has been anointed king. He has killed Goliath. He has made a name for himself. And there are other people around that recognize that David has been appointed king. And Saul is not happy. Saul is chasing David. And David is doing everything he can to stay alive. And he's doing everything he can to keep Saul alive. Right? And so they have been running away. And they get to Nob, which is where the tabernacle is. Right? Which was the kind of the temple at that time. Because the temple wasn't a permanent place till Solomon. So the tabernacle is in Nob, which is where the holies of holies is, which is where the high priest is. And he comes up to the high priest, Ahimelech, something like that. And he says, look, I'm on business from Saul. Right? So he lies to him. And the priests are going to die later because David lied to him. So this is not an excuse to lie. It's not giving you permission to lie. Right? But he says to him, now therefore, what have you on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, or whatever can be found. And the priest answered David and said, there's no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread, if the young men have at least kept themselves from women. Right? And this holy bread that he's talking about is the showbread. Right? They would take 12 loaves of bread, and they would put them on the altar, and those 12 loaves of bread would stay on the altar for a whole week, right? Every Sabbath, the bread would be changed out, okay? And so the showbread has been changed out, and the bread that's taken away, the old bread, that goes to the priests, okay? And according to the book of Leviticus, I believe it is, the bread is meant for Aaron and his children, so for the priests. The priests get to have this as their substance. It's kind of part of their payment, right? And not only is this bread specifically meant for the priests, but it's meant to be in a holy place, in a holy way, right? But this day that David is doing this happens to be the Sabbath. Right? And so David is getting bread on the Sabbath. You know, he's not just getting the gleans things, he's getting actual bread. Right? And note, the priests had to exchange the bread on the Sabbath, so they had to do a little bit of something. Right? And so David says, bring me the bread. David answers the priest and said to him, truly, women have been kept from us about 3 days since I came out, and the vessels of the young men are holy. And the bread is in effect common, even though it was consecrated in the vessels this day. Right? In other words, these guys, they've already been ceremonially clean. We've left where we were at least 3 days ago. They have not been with their wives in 3 days. So they are as pure as you can have them be right now. And they're kind of really starving because we kind of left in a hurry. We didn't bring our stuff with us. And this bread, it's not on the altar anymore. You took it off the altar. It's okay. So, verse 6, so the priest gives him holy bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread, which had been taken from before the Lord, in order to put hot bread in its place on the day when it was taken away. Right? And so he's given the bread. Right? So David's not really a priest, but David had a need which was a little bit higher than that of the priest at that moment. Right? And if you read Matthew Henry's commentary on 1 Samuel there, Matthew Henry will point out that the whole reason this story is included is to remind us that what is morally necessary is more important than our ceremony. Right? What is morally right is more important than our traditions. Okay? Does that make sense? And so David takes the bread because he needs it. He has an actual physical need for the food. The priest gives him the bread because the priest is able to. All right? And then if we were to carry on, we find that the priest actually prays about it too. And never is David condemned for taking the bread. Never is the priest really condemned other than by Saul for giving David the bread. Right? He's doing this on a Sabbath. And so Jesus is saying, remember what David did. He had a need. His need was more important than the ceremony. And so we're going to take care of his need first. The ceremony can come afterwards. The tradition can come after the morality. Well, the same is true for the disciples there. The same is true in yours and my life, right? We have traditions. We have rules that are not necessarily biblical that we set up, right? We are Baptists, and so we could go back through the history of Baptists, right? Actually, a friend of mine said, Gary is one of the least Baptist people I know. And I looked at him and said, I'm one of the most Baptist people you know, right? He goes, yeah, but you're okay with dancing? Well, yeah, the Bible tells us to dance. Well, in the history of Baptists, dancing wasn't okay because, well, dancing could lead to other things, right? Because, the waltz is a pretty risque dance. Right? Because you got two people facing each other. But the Bible tells us to dance, right? But we were trying to stop getting close to the sin, and so we said, nope, can't do that. Traditionally, Baptists don't play cards, right? Because playing cards is associated with gambling, and well, the Bible tells us not to cast lots and not to gamble, right? And so Baptists play cards, but you can play cards without gambling. It's okay. How many of you guys have played Uno with your grandchildren or your children, right? I quit playing Uno. It's not a good game. Well, not because it's morally bad, but because I can't win. We make these rules and then, wait a minute. Or here's one. I like this one because Baptists, the school that I come from, tend to not like rock and roll. Rock and roll is the devil's music. Some of us grew up with that. Well, what makes it the devil's music? It's the drum. Boom, 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 boom. Or it's the electric guitar, right? Well, there's a guy by the name of Charles Zwingli. He was a reformer. He said that the organ was an evil instrument. I've not been to a Baptist church without an organ. Whether it's electric or it's pipe or whatever, we make these rules and then we get angry at people for not following the rules we made that aren't biblical. And we start trying to condemn them and cast them out because they didn't follow our rules. Right? And every church kind of does this. Every kind of individual does this. Right? Another big one, alcohol, right? There's a lot of people. If you were to talk to my mother, anyone who drinks alcohol is not a good Christian, right? And it's like, well, wait a minute. So what about Timothy? He was told to have a little bit of wine with his supper because he had a stomach ache and he needed that little bit of alcohol. So where do you really draw the line? Well, the Bible doesn't tell us not to drink alcohol. It says don't get drunk, right? This is not me saying that you should go out and drink alcohol, because the Bible does also say, a strong drink, that's for people who are dying, people who are mourning, people who aren't leading anybody, right? People who have no hope. But to tell somebody that, hey, you had a drink, therefore you can't be a strong Christian, well, that's wrong, right? We can't put our rules, our restrictions on other people. In fact, the rules that God has given us, they weren't meant to beat us down. And this is the other part about this, right? He gives us, hey, look at the example of David. David did what he needed to do, and we got to allow for those things. He says, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath, right? The traditions were made to help us out. They weren't made to burden us. They weren't made to control us. They were made to guide us, right? When we talk about the law, and some people would come here and go, look, that means we don't have to follow the law. Well, that's not exactly what it means, right? The law is still there to guide us. But when we're following the law, we should actually look at what did it actually say? What did God actually tell us? Because let's face it, it's when we add things to the law where we get screwed up. It's where we start saying, well, God said this and this. Prime example, in the actual prime sense of the first example, is Eve, right? Sitting there in the garden, and the serpent said, did God say you cannot eat of the fruit? And she said, well, God said if we eat or touch of the fruit, right? And she added it to it. Right? She added to God's law right away. And the serpent goes, well, that's not going to happen. And so she touches the fruit and, she didn't die. And it wasn't until she actually broke God's law. Right? And God's law was there for her well-being, so that she wouldn't die. It was there to guide her. Right? So the rules that we were given, the things in the Bible, they're there to lead us to a good place. But the danger is we want to know how close to that line we can get. Or we want to stay so far away from that line that we forget that there's another edge. I had a pastor who once tried to explain it this way. And again, remember, I come from a very strong Baptist tradition, And so he said, well, look, let's take a sin as a cliff, and we're trying to draw the line back here so that we don't get anywhere near that cliff, which is how I feel about cliffs. Right? Which my wife does not feel. She gets up to that cliff and she looks over. Right? And I'm like, you're 3 feet too close, at least 6 feet. Right? But the reality is that Jesus calls it a middle path. Right? That the middle road, the straight and narrow. Right? If you draw the line here and say, all right, I'm going to stay as far away from that line as possible, well, you stepped off the other end, right? And we have a tendency, when we try to give people rules, when we try to give them regulations that aren't Scripture, we tend to push them the other direction and leave them off the other end of the bridge. Which, bridges are another story. Don't get me started on those. The rules we were given was so that we could know how to walk. They were put there so that we could do the things we needed to do, right? The Sabbath was established because it turns out physically, mentally, emotionally, we need rest. We need to slow down from time to time. It wasn't there to stop us from doing things. It wasn't there to hold our hands down and to say, aha, right? It wasn't there to be a sort of entrapment. But it was there for our benefit. And so Jesus says, look, Sabbath was made for man, therefore the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. And he finishes this discussion with that. Right? Son of Man, as I've said many times, is a reference to his deity. It is one of his favorite names for himself in the book of Mark, right? The Son of Man. And they recognized that the Son of Man was the perfect man, the one who would represent what mankind was supposed to be pre-sin, right? And the Son of Man, he says, is Lord of the Sabbath. In other words, Jesus is claiming in this statement that he is above the laws of God. That he, not above it is not quite the right word, that he is in control of them, right? It's fun when kids come into my classroom and they try to catch me on one of my rules. And I look at them and say, you do know that I'm the guy in charge, right? I'm the boss. The rules are there because I put them there, right? And then there are a couple of times where I say, well, that's not my rule, that's the school's rule. And so we're all going to follow it, right? Or our children, all of our kids have done this at some point or another. Well, Dad said we're not supposed to do that. Well, Dad decided we're going to do that now, right? Because Dad makes the rules. Or Mom said we're not allowed to do that. Okay, well, Mom's doing it. So it's okay for Mom to do it because they like to tattle on each other, right? Or tattle on us. Mom's doing something she told us we're not allowed to do. Yeah, well, she's Mom. She's capable of doing things you can't do, right? Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath. And so this is another one of those claims of deity. Because there's only one person who is above God's rules, who are in control of God's rules, who can make God's rules, who can bend God's rules, and that is God. And so Jesus is God himself, and he makes that claim here. And he uses this simple, hey, they decided they wanted a little bit of food. I'd make myself a sandwich on the Sabbath. I'm okay with it because we need to eat. That need is there. The rules were made to guide us, to help us to see him, to help us to know him. And ultimately, he's in charge. He gets to make the rules. He gets to do what he wants because he's God. So let's bow in prayer.